Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Game Industry Legends. My name is Melissinos, and I'm the Principal Evangelist for Video Games at AWS. And on this episode, I will be speaking with industry legend Graeme Devine. Graeme is a veteran game developer with more than 40 years of experience making video games. At age 16, he started working on games for Atari and eventually co-founded Trilobyte, a game company that created the best-selling games The Seventh Guest and The 11th Hour. After launching these groundbreaking titles, he went to work for id Software, where he helped design Quake 3 Arena and worked on Doom 3. Before his role at Magic Leap as their wandering wizard, working on cutting-edge AR technologies, Graeme was the chairman of the International Game Developers Association from 2002 to 2003, and also worked at Ensemble Studios on Age of Empires 3 and Halo Wars. Then off to Apple to help lead their game technologies group, and finally leaving Apple to start GRL Games with his wife and daughter, where they created the best-selling and chart-topping full-deck solitaire for the Mac and iOS. Upon leaving Magic Leap in 2020, he formed a new game company, QXR Studios, where he and his team are creating a CCG game, Metropolis Origins, based on his Metropolis game property he created more than 30 years ago. A true pioneer, leader, and futurist, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Graeme Devine to the Game Industry Legends program. Graeme, thank you so much for joining us on the Game Industry Legends program today.
Thank you for having me here today.
Awesome. All right, so before we started the program, you and I were talking about the early days of computers and what we had access to as kids, right? So let's start there. So tell us again about your earliest days with computers and video games. Like, what was the first computer you remember having in the home, or the first systems that you remember programming on when you were a kid?
First computer in the home was, I think, a Trans Am Triton, which was a Z80 processor computer. It came with basically just a software assembly editor. So it had 4 kilobytes of RAM. It came with a 1 kilobyte basic interpreter that you had to type in every time you switched the computer on. So you had to type that in correctly. After that, I had a TRS-80, which of course also had a Z80 processor in it. It came with a 4 kilobyte basic built into it. But also used computers at my dad's work, which was an ICL computer and a VAX 11780 connected to a VT100, the best terminal ever made.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, you are picking up systems, though, that are really at the dawn of personal computers or computers, right, coming into the home.
You said I've been in the industry for 30 years, and yeah, it's a little longer than that.
Yeah. Well, I should have said at least 30 years. At least 30 years. Yeah, I mean, most people start off with, well, of course, Trash 80s, right? I remember the TRS-80 Model 3 at my elementary school, growing up, and I had, VIC 20. That was like the first big one from us. But you were working on some really anemic systems. But even then, those systems, the possibilities that they uncovered, right, in terms of being able to create and to see that reflected back must have just been extraordinary at that time.
Oh yeah, I remember playing Adventure for the very first time and just trying to desperately to work out how to see the source code for it.
Yeah.
And eventually getting to see the Fortran source code. And so it's like, Fortran, how can I write more Fortran?
Well, I was going to say, so that's when you started program. What language? So Fortran, I guess, was probably the first real computer language, or was it, well, BASIC, right? BASIC interpreter.
Actually, assembly code was the first. I didn't learn any language other than assembly code until after the Seventh Guest.
Really?
Yeah. I looked at Fortran and, I could understand it, but, it was assembly code all the way through Seventh Guest. And after Seventh Guest, 11th Hour was the first thing I did in C. So just assembly code was always so natural for me. And because I did a little stint at Lucasfilm, I got to use Chip Morningstar's Macross assembler, which has some functionality to it, some logic to it. You can, dot if not zero, else .ndif and so forth. And so I made a version of that for the Z80 assembler because he did it for 6502. And so that made assembly code a little bit more logical. So that was became kind of my go-to compiler.
I mean, and so one of the things in that era, right, was actually writing your own languages or writing your own compilers, right, to do things so they were more natural for the individual programmer that was programming. And, you know, one of the stories I love is, you know, talking to Sid Meier about pirates and how he did that on the Commodore 64. And, you know, what people don't realize unless you talk to Sid or you kind of unpack that code is, you know, no frame buffer on C64. So that blue border around there is basically the frame buffer, right? And he's loading graphics into there that are then moving in. And that's how he was able to get this really smooth movement happening. And I said, what a wonderful, you know, technique for this older machine. You know, we should, you know, use this to teach kids how to program. And he goes, well, the problem is nobody would be able to read that code. I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, it's written for Sidtran, which was my own language that I wrote so I could create games like Pirates. And it was, you know, you had to go ahead and stretch those machines in a variety of different ways to squeeze, you know, the stories we wanted to tell, the interaction that we wanted to create out of them, right? So clearly, but I mean, doing this in assembly all the way up through 7th guest. All right, crazy. All right, but we're going to dig in. We're going to dig into those. But I want to talk about your earliest kind of professional game development work. So you started working for Atari at the age of 16.
I did a few games before then for a company called Softtech. So I made some games for the ZX Spectrum, Firebirds, Software Monitor, a whole bunch of little games just for the ZX Spectrum. And it was always a problem getting my royalties from the guy. I used to have to go off on a train to London and sit on the guy's doorstep to go get my royalties, and I never really got my royalties. But I do remember with my first royalty check for Firebirds, I went and bought the very first Sony CD player, a CDP 101, and I bought every CD that was in existence at the time, all 2 of them. And so one time I had the entire CD collection that was on the planet.
There you go.
But I did see an ad in the back of Computing Today for Atari, and it was looking for programmers to work on Atari Soft, and they were looking for someone to work on pole position. And so I thought, well, I'm interested in that. So I worked on a quick little version of pole position for the Spectrum, and I made a version of the road that was, you know, that scrolled away on the screen. And I went up to Slough, because Atari Soft was based in Slough in the UK. And I showed them what I'd done. And I sat in a room with, you know, a 16, and there was a room of not 16-year-olds all in the room with me, all interviewing. And at the end of the day, they were like, Graeme, you actually had a demo of RAM. You're hired.
Amazing. So, okay, so we also know, I mean, Mark Cerny, right, another very famous game developer, was working at Atari when he was 17 and did Marble Madness, right? Did you ever cross paths there, or, you know, I mean, obviously...
I don't think he came to Slough. We were in... Atari Soft there was working on the British computer versions of the games. We were doing some Coleco games, maybe, but most of what we did was service arcade machines. It was a big service for the Atari and Namco arcade machines, and all the British computer Atari Soft machines. So there was never a promise of the American side of Atari that was coming up. Of course, at the time, the Amiga was still inside Atari, so there was a couple of prototype Atari ST computers with the Amiga chip inside, and so there was Atari STs with the bouncing ball on, and so that was always fun, of the promise of the next thing, but it was never to be.
Yeah, and we talked about this, you know, again prior to jumping on the call here, that RJ Michael was or Michael was the first one that we the first interview that we did here on the series, right? And of course, he went in and speaks at length and just so lovingly about the Amiga and during that whole era, right? And that's the thing, the industry was so small, and it's still, for as big as it is, it's still relatively small. in that people really do know each other. But back then, it was everybody just kind of climbing over each other, working on, these separate projects are constantly floating between companies, back and forth to work with each other, right? Just really,
of
just
course,
incredible.
Yeah, the game industry in the UK was, less than 100 people. It was absolutely tiny. We all got together at everyone's house and watched TV, and it was absolutely incredible. I remember Jeff Minter had a projection, a projection TV set, and it was at the time like, oh my God, you have a thing that projects onto a wall, a TV image. We can go and watch movies on.
You could do that, or you could play Grid Runner or Attack of the Mutant Camels or something that Jeff was working on back then.
But we were just so amazed that he had this thing.
Exactly. All right. We have a lot to get through, so I'm going to try to restrain myself because I got a million stories that I would love to talk to you about, but I want to get through your history here. That's what people are listening for. So, so you started doing this at Atari, and Pole Position was one of the big ones. What other games did you work on at Atari?
Well, I helped on a lot of versions of Pole Position. So I did the ZX Spectrum version of Pole Position. Then I helped a little bit on the C64 version of Pole Position. And then on the MSX version of Pole Position. The MSX is, of course, the computer that Microsoft never made.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
a great little machine.
Books. It was awesome.
Same chipset as the ColecoVision, actually, right? So that's basically what they could have been doing with it, but.
And, the whole just MIDI, set up. But after Atari, I started to work on Ball Blazer because at that time, Lucasfilm was working with Atari to publish Ball Blazer. And unfortunately, then Jack Tramiel bought Atari and I was laid off. But fortunately, Activision said, Graeme, we're going to publish Ball Blazer now and carry on. So I was lucky enough to go from Atari to Activision and to be able to carry on doing a Ball Blazer.
Awesome. Amazing. All right. So after Atari and doing some of the work there, you had a couple of other companies that you founded. One was, I think, Program Techniques and IC&D, right? What did IC&D stand for? Well,
Program Techniques was my lesson in founding a company, and I made a game called Excel for the ZX Spectrum, and it made a lot of money. And then my partners took all the money out of the bank account overnight, and my other partner got addicted to cocaine, and that company went down the drain. And that was a big lesson for me, and how to lose everything in one day. IC&D was Industrial Concepts and Design, but we always called it Ice Cream and Donuts. And it did a lot of contracting for Mastertronic. I partnered that company with Tim Ansell, who went on to found Creative Assembly. And so I left the UK and he carried on with IC&D and its contracts, and he converted it into Creative Assembly. So I like to think that company's still going in some way.
Yeah.
But we did a lot of games. Of course, the Metropolis game that we take the IP from today for Metropolis Origins, a game called Enterprise, and Turbo Champions, a road race game that is the boxes were around here somewhere, and a whole bunch of conversions that we did for Mastertronic, because back then we could do a conversion in weeks. It was, hey, can you make a game? And like, yes, we can do that.
See, but that's what I remember about Virgin Mastertronic, right? So over here in the States, well, first of all, when you're a kid, right? The name Virgin, everyone's just like, oh, of course, yeah. Right? Because you're, 10, 12 years old, right? And that's seen there. But then it was Mastertronic. And I remember that triangle shape with the grid pattern on it, the big 3D M that came off. And we were like, what the hell is this? Because all these games felt very European, right? We didn't have these types of games. And there were also budget titles. So we could actually get a bit more for our dollar by, using or buying Virgin Mastertronic games. But the big one that really kind of stuck with me was the Spot puzzle game. And that was the puzzle game that was based off of the 7-Up mascot, Spot, right? And I remember first seeing that on Amiga at the mall that I worked at, and loved the animation of that Spot made moving about the board. So can you tell me a little bit about your work on Spot and how that happened?
Dan Chang and I made that game for the 8-bit NES originally, and we made that in my apartment in Santa Ana. And it was originally a game called Attacks for the Amiga, in the UK, and it came across, and Martin Alper at Mastertronic was like, "Oh, we got to convert this into an IP. We got to convert this into 7-Up, because the 7-Up icon is round and things in this game are round."
So why not? Right.
So Dan Chang and I made it into a 7-Up Spot, and we worked for. At that time, Mastertronic didn't have an NES license, so Martin, in his infinite wisdom, said, "Here's a photocopy that I have of the NES manual." And it was a photocopy in Japanese of the NES manual. And it literally had coffee stains on it throughout it. And you're going to have to burn EPROMs in order to be able to program it. So Dan and I would go every morning to Toys R Us and buy a Zelda gold cartridges from Toys R Us, in order to be able to rip the ROM out and so that we could burn EPROMs with the code on it. And that was how we made the game.
Okay, you know, the game historian side of me is like, what are you doing to those cartridges, man?
Oh yeah, we had to line up with moms who were really pissed at us for seeing us day after day, who were there. Because that gold Zelda cartridge was one of the only ones that had the little link that allowed you to solder across to convert it from a ROM to an EPROM. And
really,
but yeah, but what a way to make a game! It's like the only way to run your code is to burn an EPROM and just put it into an actual NES and to see if it ran.
Oh my god, I love that.
And so we worked for 6 weeks to 8 weeks, and we got the game finished, and we went to CES in Vegas, Dan and I. And we were both sicker than dogs. We both had the flu, and we turn up and we give it to give the game to Martin, and he's like, "You guys have to go home. You're gonna die." But thank you.
And look, this aligns with what we were just talking about. You know, about being kids growing up, right, with the very first computers home. Is that it was really by hook or by crook you got this thing done. To have to go buy cartridges off the shelves so you could actually modify them, so you could go ahead and burn your ear pump just to be able to get the demos. I mean, that's what it took back then, right? It was all still so new, still so fragile, right?
And I almost got fired for a Spot as well, because I actually put credits into the game. And Martin got so pissed over that that he almost fired me.
What?
After the game had shipped and all the cartridges were on a boat, he calls me into his office and he's yelling at me, "There's credits in this game." And I'm like, "How do you find that?" And one of the testers had found it. And the way you get to the credits in Spot is if you play. There's an AI in the game, and if you play the AI on hard, in all four corners, at the end of the game, it will come up. There's a little display of fireworks, and the crowd which is little Spot guys, will actually all go and do credits. So it'll go through the credits of the art and the programming and the sound and the music and everything. And Mon, he's like, "I'm gonna fire you, but you made this game. Just don't do it again."
Yeah, and that was the thing, right? In that era, people weren't credited really for the games, or we know that in certain cases, like Japanese companies, if there were credits, people would be working under pseudonyms, so they wouldn't be the actual names, or they would try to create Western sounding names for people, and some of them were hilarious, right? Because you're like, I don't think that word means what you think it means, and that's not really a name for somebody, right? And so that was a big thing, and it, unfortunately, even today, right, we still have an issue with making sure that we give proper credit to anybody that works on games. Some studios are much better and are excellent at it. Others, right, are still trying to catch up. But I'm a firm believer if you worked on it, your name should get on it, right?
That's why Seventh Guest had such good credits, even music over the credits. And we went and got everyone's photograph and made sure. And Martin had to just watch him.
All right. So real quickly, what were the other like memorable games that you worked on at Mastertronic? The ones that really stick out for you, like what are the, one or two, maybe three games?
Well, the other big thing at Mastertronic was always Martin would give me a $500 bonus if I could bring the number of diskettes down from like 4 down to 1. So that was my beginnings in compression. Was he would say, Graeme, this game has four floppy disks. That's going to cost me like $4. If you can make it cost me $1 to sell it, I'll give you $500. So I would rewrite all the sectors and compress them using like LCW compression in order to be able to do a sector loader and earn my $500. So I supplemented my paycheck back then by running DOS loaders for games. But
yes, you could have made a whole enterprise by saying, well, this game is going to take 9 disks, apparently, and already knowing that you're padding it, right? Or not breaking up correctly. And see, that would have been the way to supplement that.
But War in Middle-earth, no, was it why? Yeah, War in Middle-earth, Why Me, was one of the big games that I was producer on that Synergistic Software made. And it was a huge production. It took us like 6 months to make the game. And it turns out, it's a great RPG, but if you take the party and you just go to the cracks of doom, just straight across the map diagonally, you can win the game in like 2 moves. Like, oh, darn, it's meant to take 40 hours.
See, that's a speed run that we have to do.
Yeah, that's a speed run. Don't tell anyone about that.
That's right. That's right. That's just for us. That's just for us.
The Arcadia arcade machine, which is based on the A500 Amiga board, was one of the favorite things I worked on there. And that was a foray into making arcade machines that was versus the Nintendo arcade machine, which had a whole bunch of NES games inside it. So we learned a lot about making arcade machines that had basically 10 games inside it for that all used Amiga games. So a lot of them were games that Mastertronic made, and some of them were like Link's Golf was one of the games, and Slam Dunk, Magic Johnson's Slam Dunk was one of the games. But a lot of lessons about making arcade games. And I remember one of the best lessons was, why has our machine come back from the bowling alley absolutely destroyed? And it was, our coin drop only had 1 bit to detect coin drops. And so if you don't pull the coin drop fast enough, you can put 2 coins in, and so it would lose coins. And so if your arcade machine does that, your machine will get beat up with a bowling, with a bowling ball pretty quick. Also, don't test in a bowling alley.
Yeah. Wise words. All right, so you leave Virgin Mastertronic, and you found a company called Trilobyte with Rob Landros, right? And
yes.
you both met at Virgin Games. Correct?
Yes, we both met at Virgin. Rob and I were starting to get interested in doing CD-ROMs. CDI was starting to get big at the time from Philips, and we were going to a lot of conferences. And Twin Peaks was on the air, David Lynch's Twin Peaks, and Mastertronic had the rights to Clue. And so we wrote up this huge game design for Martin called Guest that was basically, let's take the Clue game and turn it into more of a puzzle game and do it on CD-ROM, because everything we saw on CD-ROM was basically just text games or encyclopedias or very little graphics, and we were going to do a graphics game. And so we wrote up this design doc. It's full of puzzles based on kind of the Fool's Errand a little bit. And we gave it to Martin, and Martin came in 2 hours later, and he's like, let's go to lunch. Because Martin's like, well, I'm going to let you go. I'm going to actually let both of you go, because the future of Mastertronic is in cartridges. We don't actually believe in CD-ROM, but I'm going to let you make this game. I'm going to let you make some, I'm going to let you make Guest. but you have to make a floppy disk version too. And you can't move more than 10 miles away from the office, and you have to make a floppy disk version. So we immediately moved to Oregon, which is about 500 miles away. And we never made a floppy disk version.
Hey, again, you could have made a lot of money with the 200 floppy disk version, right? Getting that compression down.
Because it was a 2 CD game. I called Martin up and said, "Hey, we can make this into a 1 CD game." Because it turns out, we only need 1 CD in the end. He's like, "No, it's huge that it's 2 CDs. It's the first 2 CD game ever. It's huge. Just leave it on 2." I'm like, okay.
Well, look, I mean, back then too. So I remember when I first saw, the Seventh Guest, right? And I mean, Myst was the game that made everyone go, "Oh my goodness!" Right? This is just something completely different. It was the audio, it was the presentation, but everything was static for the most part, right? Although what was wonderful was having Rand at the Art of Video Games opening. We were there, and it was great because we had the Myst game actually crashed on the museum floor before the press had walked in, and I'm like, "You've got to be kidding me!" Like the head of the museum has every major news outlet from around the world, coming into the museum. So we're like, "What's going on?" It's like, "Oh wait, Rand is in the building." So I bring him upstairs through the back side of the exhibition, and we're looking, and he's like, "I know what this is. This is a problem with Windows. Let me get into the config sys file." So he's in there changing some stuff around, and the stuff reboots, and we're literally just running out the back room while all the press comes walking in with Myst now finally running on original hardware. And he's like, "That's the most surreal nonsense that I've had to deal with in a very long time." But one of the things that we talked about was, video, then you had a postage stamp. And so you had to make the rest of the world feel very big. So in the beginning of Myst, you're going down this elevator and you come into the room and it's all slideshows, right? It's basically HyperCard, right? All the slideshow stuff happening. And then there are this little bars on the elevator door. And so that you could see the stone moving through it. So the whole room felt like it's moving when all they're doing is animating this. And so that's what we were used to. But Seventh Guest comes out, and I remember, first stepping into the into the foyer there, and then watching the entire world pivot with with pre-rendered stuff, and then moving in to the very first puzzle room where you see these apparitions, right, come up in this full motion video overlaid on these 2D elements. So I promise I'm getting to my question. When we talked about what changes were going to the industry at the time, you nailed it, right? This new medium CD-ROM, we didn't know exactly what it was going to be, but the opportunity that it presented was really tremendous. What was it like working on that early technology to do what you did with Seventh Guest? That just must have been, it was the cutting edge of the industry at that time.
We just didn't know any better. We made the video above my comic book store in Medford in 2 days against the blue screen that we bought at Home Depot. And one of the actors fell through the blue screen on day 1.
Who were the actors? Were they friends of yours? Did you hire these people? Tell us about the production of this.
It was an acting group out of Ashland, and actually, they were our saviors. That was a theater group led by the actress who played Martine Burden, socialized in the game, and she was just absolutely fabulous, absolutely excellent. And so it was. Without her, I don't think the Seventh Guest would be, the game that it actually is, because she brought all of the pantomime to the Seventh Guest. I mean, it's over the top, right? I mean, it's not meant to be, oh my God, this is classic horror from CV or from The Shining level. It's just over the top because it has to be. You're playing it on a CD-ROM with 8-bit audio. It's in order to get that through, you've got to be over the top. So it was. that made all the difference in the world. Again, the background's out. I remember it's like we'll cut out cleanly, and we could never cut out cleanly, so we just gave all the ghosts these huge auras, and we said, yeah, let's ghost aura.
Yeah.
But
that's one way, right? You make the technology limitation part of the art, right? So what systems were you developing this on, like the pre-rendered stuff and then your video? Do you remember, like, what was your workflow like? Was it PCs? Was it Amigas? Like, what were you doing?
It was all PC. I had a Dell with 8 megabytes of RAM. We didn't have networks to begin with, so it was all sneakernet. We bought these terribly cheap networks, and we had no money, because Virgin wasn't paying as much, and we were basically eating noodles for most of the project. We had to beg Virgin for a hard drive eventually that was 500 megabytes, so that we could hold one room's worth of data at a time. So we could hold the hallway, or we could hold the dining room, or we could hold the kitchen, and we could back that up to up to DAT cassettes at the end of the day, so we could go work on another room. We rendered everything with 3D Studio. We paid for our 3D Studio licenses by developing a program called Play, which was allowed you to play the high-res animations that 3D Studio put out, because I reverse engineered that. And Autodesk called up and said, hey, did you make the Play program? I'm like, yes, a little 20 kilobyte player that I wrote in assembly code that played back the FLC files. And they're like, yeah, our animation player is is 1.4 megabytes and it doesn't fit on a floppy disk. Yours is 20 kilobytes and fits on a floppy disk. Can we license it?
Oh,
and I was like,
that.
And I was like, yeah, for as many licensees of 3D Studios we can, as a company wants to have. And they're like, sure. And this is Gary Yost back then at Autodesk, and he was always wonderful to work with. And so that was the beginning of a wonderful relationship with Autodesk. And Play was a $20 shareware. So
I imagine they made their money back on the license they gave you, and then some.
We got it paid our rent some months. Play. It was, but we'd go to GDC and we'd see like there's games using players, to show their intros, and it's on repeat, and it comes up at the end. I always remember jabbing Brian Fargo. It's like, Brian, you're using Play, and you haven't even given me $20 for the Play license.
Yeah, look, there's a little shareware watermark on there that you guys haven't taken off yet. Like, pay the $20, man.
At the end, the screen comes up, and he's like, spacebar. I think you can get rid of the spacebar too.
Oh my goodness, we're gonna have to get Brian on the program too, and then we're gonna throw that story back up there too. So that's awesome.
I somehow doubt it was his responsibility to pay the $20. But
oh my goodness. All right, so go ahead, please.
It was, we didn't know. I mean, Chris Crawford, would write on Genie at the time. I don't know. Seventh Guest isn't technically possible. I will eat my shoe if Graeme makes this work, because 150 kilobytes a second you can't do that and display video. And I'm like, what?
Mm-hmm. And now he has been one shoe less ever since, right?
I don't think he ever actually, yeah.
Okay, so Seventh Guest comes out, and again, it just changed the way we thought about what could be done here, and it really set. It kind of set or raised the bar for any developer looking to develop for CD-ROM, right? And that's also at the time we saw a lot of full motion video games, right? That was really the era of the full motion video game. So then you do the follow-on to Seventh Guest, 11th Hour. So what did you learn from the Seventh Guest that you applied to the development of the 11th Hour? Were there kind of lessons learned that you were able to then avoid developing this next game, or talk to us a bit about that?
Well, we got a much better royalty deal from Virgin for the next game, because we hardly made any money from Seventh Guest. Whereas we would go down to Virgin and look at their nice new offices with their nice new production studios. And it was because most of Seventh Guest was sold through bundles. You buy the bundle with the sound card and CD drive. We made no money from that at all. That was kind of disappointing. And that was the way of contracts back then. So we had a much better contract. We made much more money from 11th Hour, but 11th Hour was much more of a troubled production than Seventh Guest. I think we were young and we just didn't really plan 11th Hour as well as we planned. Seventh Guest. 11th Hour is great. I love 11th Hour. The technology in it is great. Technology is much better. But it took a lot longer than we wanted it to take to make. Also started to lead to the split of Trilobites. At the end of it, Rob and I were talking the crunch, the stress on the company to make it was incredibly hard. At that time, towards the end of it, I keeled over and was in the hospital for a while. Started to get terrible migraines. We took all the wrong lessons from Seventh Guest of success and tried to apply them without taking the right lessons. But we made a great game, but it led to the end of the company. And so it was, I think the game we made during that time that was great was Clandestiny, because 11th Hour started production whilst I was finishing Seventh Guest. Because we finished Seventh Guest, and Tandy called up and said, "Hey, we have this computer coming out called the Tandy Sensation, and we'll place an order for 100,000 Seventh Guests if you can make it work on the Tandy Sensation." And so I was at my father-in-law's house at the time, and I'm like, "Sure, how do I get a Tandy Sensation?" And so a Tandy Sensation showed up at my father-in-law's house, and I had to sit on his kitchen table making it work whilst Rob was working on Seventh Guest or 11th Hour. Okay. So it took a little while to do that. And so Rob was away or doing 11th Hour. I was working on Seventh Guest still. But then I started working on Clandestiny because of my love of Scooby-Doo. And so Clandestiny is kind of my Scooby-Doo game, with all of the animation from Korea. And I still love that game. I still wish we'd put more time into Clandestiny than 11th Hour. But
yeah,
the Trilobite was it was a good crew.
And you're probably the only person that has or had hands on that Tandy machine too, right?
There was a ton of Tandy sold, because the great thing about Tandy at the time was when they bought product, they couldn't return it. So if they bought 100,000 units, they bought 100,000 units without ever returning them. So that order was a one-way order. It was...
my first big PC that I bought at home was a Tandy 1000, I think an SL or something like that.
Oh, that was a great machine.
It was. But you could also, if you replace the Intel processor that came with an NEC V20, it changed like the instruction pipeline from like 8 to 6 or 4, so you could squeeze like another like half megahertz out of the thing. So at that time, you're like, this game is running a little bit faster all of a sudden. So yeah. It
had that 16 color mode as well. It was
it did. Yeah, it did. People don't, I mean, and that's also where like the IBM PC Junior were taking its cues to go ahead and use basically the Tandy graphic format, right? Also the audio too on the Tandy was awesome.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, so, that Tandy 1000. I had one of those. I loved it.
Yeah, it was a great little machine. And I'll tell you a story another time about having to go ahead and remove hard jumpers on a MFM driver, a card, so I could use, or an MDM hard drive. And because Tandy, I think, set all of their hard-coded IRQs to like IRQ 7, but the industry was IRQ 5. And so, but I got it to work. But that's another story for another time. Okay, so all right, so you, you basically put as much you could possibly put into Trilobite. You have all the big developer experience now under your belt: Atari, Activision, LucasArts, right? These other companies you've done contract work for that we didn't even get a chance to talk about. And then you left Trilobite and to join John Carmack and the team over at id Software. Like, how did that happen?
Well, actually, at Trilobytes, we started to use Nix computers. And so that became our main, on 11th hour, we started to use Nix computers, and that became our main way of actually working, was doing all code on Nix machines, because they were very solid machines. So we actually got to know Steve Jobs a little bit. And so Steve actually introduced me to John Carmack.
All right.
Actually, I just read John Romero's book where John was like, said, "Hey, I hear Graeme uses Nix machines. We should get some Nix machines." So Steve introduced John and I, and we kind of hit it off. So John at the time was working on Quake 1, and he was like, "I need something that loads Targa files." So, and of course, in 7th Guest, we use Targa files because it's a 3D studio. And I'm like, "Well, here's the Targa loader for 7th Guest." And then he was like, "Well, I need something that plays Red Recordia for..." And so I gave him the Red Recordia player from 7th Guest too. So Quake 1's Red Recordia player and Targa file loader is actually from 7th Guest. So I actually have code in there. And so John and I always talked, and he would send me pictures from the game of like coming at you in real time with renders from Quake 1 of like catching up, and we talked back and forth. And at the end of Trilobytes, we talked quite a little bit, and he was like, "Well, we need someone that can stitch together it a little bit more, kind of manage the company and help with the design, and you're a techie, so I can talk to you." So
yeah, that's a big plus for him.
Yeah, that was a big plus for him.
Yeah.
And so that became much. So I went there. At the time, Quake 3 was pretty far along, and a lot of the maps were done, but it was still. It needed all the AI to be done, it needed the bots to be done, and a lot of maps were still to be made, and the networking was still not in a good place still. It worked on LANs, but it didn't work on the internet. And at that point, John was like, "No menus in the game. We're just going to use the console. And, it's just going to be a console experience." John, we need menus. We really need menus. A lot of convincing on the menus. But that's how I ended up, at id, was through a connection from Steve Jobs. And actually, that was the strangest thing.
That's an amazing thing. Now, you were also the producer on Quake 3 for the Dreamcast, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So our mutual friend, Scott Hawkins, was over there working at Sega on the Dreamcast. I think he was one of the producers on it there, right? And that was the first console that came with networking right out of the box. So, what was that like seeing this game now running on 56K console modems, right?
That was incredible. I only made it work on the LAN adapter too, which only came out in Japan, but we got one. But to get that working at 32 megs, that was because that console was just incredible. And Quake 3 looked incredible on it, and it played so wonderfully. I was just always blown away at the quality of the game just running on the Dreamcast there.
Yeah, no, it was amazing. Of course, the network was running on Sun Microsystems computers at the time, so of course, they just work great. That was that's when I got connected to the folks over at back during my Sun days, and the Heat.net, network backend that they had built that was running all of that stuff.
We were convinced by Halo that we could actually make the game work, because at the time, inside id, we were very poo-poo on a controller being able to play an FPS game.
Yeah.
And so, but when Halo came out, we were all like, "Oh, okay.
I guess
that's
you
really
can."
Good.
All right, we still have a lot of your history to rip through, so I'm going to move us on to. All right, so Quake 3, huge Dreamcast, amazing port of it, right? And then Quake 3 Arena, right, came out of that. Awesome stuff. Of course, competing with Unreal Tournament and all that stuff at that time. Then you moved on to Doom 3. Now, Doom 3 really became, I think, this kind of seismic shift for the first-person shooter genre, because I remember seeing that pinky demon at the beginning of the Doom 3 demo when it comes around the corner after, they walk in, it's the lighting and everything there. was truly terrifying. What's really cool, though, is actually somebody did an HTML5 port of Doom 3 that you could run in a browser on your desktop, and it's freaking Doom 3 in a browser. It's completely crazy. But tell us about the work that you were doing on Doom 3, and what was it like then? Because I remember what the press was like when Doom 3 dropped.
Oh, well, there was a very hard period at id for the press because of Columbine. That was hard. I remember going down in the elevator one day and walking out, and there was this man with a clipboard, and he had the pictures of everyone who works there, and there was numbers under the picture of dollar signs. And he's like, "Is this you?" Like, no. And I went right back up, and we had to call the cops, and we had police protection for a long time, and that wasn't good. That was very bad, and that was not a good time. That was, but yeah, it didn't affect what we made, but affected our how we thought.
Yeah,
and
yeah, I think
it made me think a lot about what I was doing, because actually I left it during Doom 3 because I was I was working one day on the blood squirts coming out of demons, and how the blood squirts would be go faster if you were over a pentagram, and they would squirt onto the wall further. And I was like, I got to move on from this. And this was not my cup of tea. As much as I love the horror genre, I'm more Scooby-Doo than Doom 3.
Yeah, more jump scares than blood splats, right?
And John was there for the technical side of, oh my God, the stencil shadows and everything. And it doesn't surprise me it runs it in a browser because of his adherence to pure C++ code that runs really well. I mean, I learned so much about programming from John. So that's really good to I have to go try that.
Yeah, but, I'll make sure I shoot the link over to you.
Yeah. I really got to, I did leave it, during Quake, during Doom 3, and I always remember John saying, no one leaves it during a project, and I'm like, I just got to go. So it was time.
Yeah, but then you left id to join Ensemble Studios, right? And you worked on two big titles there, Age of Empires 3 and Halo Wars, right? So two completely different genres of games. I cannot play RTS games because being ADD, I cannot keep track of everything, and none of it holds my attention. But I appreciate it. I appreciate the complexity and depth of those. But these are different genres. Like, which one was your favorite to work on?
Well, Halo was, of course, because I was the lead designer on it.
There you go. That's called the softball question in the interviews.
The Age of Empires 3, I did the pathing on it, and I learned all about pathing. So pathing is a really hard problem. I was talking to a university professor yesterday, and he's like, "Yeah, we teach pathing." I'm like, "No, you teach A-star. You don't teach pathing. Pathing in an RTS game is an extremely different problem. It's second-to-second units that you're trying to get into an order that looks like it's in a convoy, and there's 1,000 other units coming from the side that will interrupt that order, and it's not A-star. It's a completely different problem, and you try to do that in microseconds. But Halo Wars didn't start out as Halo Wars. It started out as Project Phoenix. It started out as its own IP, all about an alien race called the Sway coming down to beat the humans. And it was presented to me one day that's, hey, Graeme, do you want to make the first RTS game for the Xbox 360? And I'm like, sure. And so we came up with this new IP. And we made Phoenix, and we came up with the rule of 8, which is how an RTS game could work on a controller. And we presented it to Microsoft at the Greenlight meeting, and they were like, "This is great. This plays great. This game design is great," because the alien race was extremely alien. You had to build this fence around the aliens, and it would go dark for a while, and you had to sacrifice all your all your helpers in order to level up. But they said there's one problem. You got to turn it into Halo. and I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, you got to turn it into Halo. And at that time, Bungie made Halo games. So they were still part of Microsoft, and I was a fan of Halo, but it was just fast-moving purple things in front of you that you shot.
Right.
I didn't really know the canon at all. I didn't really know. And I've developed all this deep canon for my game, for my IP. And I was like, no. And they're like, you got to turn it into Halo, or we're laying everyone off. I'm like, oh, okay.
Oh, so then you went, yes. Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah. I'm like, yeah. Let me think about that till Monday. And they're like, you go till Monday. So on Monday, I'm like, yeah. So we went up to Bungie, and Bungie was fabulous, absolutely fabulous, absolutely incredible company. And I'm so glad that I said yes, and I was wrong to say no, and I should have said yes immediately. And the canon is incredible. The canon is just so deep and so wonderful. I love to be able to contribute to it. I would petition Bungie by sending like tourist catalogs to them for the planet Arcadia. Like, I want to add this planet Arcadia. Here's a tourist catalog for it. And Joe Staten would say, "Cool." So, and I'll send out daily blogs to the team for the Spirit of Fire, and it's Shipcat Spock. So we added the AI, and it was great to be able to work on that product. So I did love Halo Wars.
Fantastic. Okay, so now Halo Wars is out, Age of Empires 3. And here comes another pivot. Like, you seem to love jumping into, when a platform is really changing the market or creating new frameworks in which to work, or, building on real cutting edge technology. You go ahead and leave consoles and PCs behind, and you move over to Apple. Like, why jump to, apart from it being Apple, right? And now knowing that Steve Jobs, the one that introduced you to Carmack, puts another twist to this. But why the jump to Apple? Like, what was happening at that moment that really attracted you to the company and what they were doing?
Well, Microsoft had closed Ensemble down. We made Halo Wars, and with 6 months to go on the project, they said, hey, at the end of this project, we're closing down Ensemble. And so that was great. But at the same time, the iPhone had come out, and we'd all lined up for the iPhone. And Paul and David Bettner were there, and I'd got an iPhone developer, a license I was looking at the time, and I was giving it to Paul and David Bettner, and they went on to make Words with Friends, which was, I guess it did okay for them.
Yeah,
but they were using my developer license, and so that they were. It was fun to see that. And I'd worked on all of the Mac versions of Quake 3, so I knew a lot of people at Apple already. So when Ensemble closed, within my inbox, within 5 minutes, Apple was like, "Hey, come out to California and take a look." And so I went out to California and talked to Apple, and I was like, "No, that's not interesting." And so they said, "Hey, come out to California again and bring your family." So Laurie, Rocky, and I went out to California, and we got put up in a nice hotel, and we got to tour around, and we talked to Apple some more, and I got to make like Bertrand Sillett, who famously wrote Malak, the memory things, and got to meet a whole bunch of people and talk to a whole bunch of people at Apple about their vision for Apple. And I was like, "Oh, this is interesting." But I didn't find out anything I was going to go do. Right. And so I said yes. And so I turned up at Apple, and I signed an NDA, and then I signed like 5 more NDAs. And I got here's your K48. And the K48, of course, was an iPad. And so I was like, oh, this is cool. And so we got to work on the iPad and make it for games. And so persuading game designers that the touchscreen is cool, that's, this touchscreen here is, very, very cool to use for, for fingers, because all game developers at the time were like, you've got to add a joypad or this thing's going to fail like bricks. If you don't add a joypad to it, it's going to be a big failure. I'm like, no, believe me, touch is cool.
It was very different than what was going on in mobile at the time, right? Where J2ME and Brew were really top of the mobile space. And I think was pretty interesting about that too is, when I was at some, we used to say, yeah, this game company, they made 2 games and they have 28 SKUs, right? Because you had to port it to everything, right? And so Apple really kind of unified the development for this across obviously a single platform, but because it could do everything, it just changed the way we thought about mobile and what mobile games would be.
And so a lot of my work was just talking to game developers and persuading them of just, hey, 11 you can put 11 fingers on this.
Right. Your hands and your nose. Right?
Your hands and your nose will fit. And
that's why they made the iPad, because you needed space for your nose, right? They couldn't do it on a phone.
And then helping the hardware team optimize it for games, and the software team optimize it for games. And so thinking about and then helping Epic get Unreal onto it and Unity get Unity onto it. And so it was fun being on that side of the table. But in the end, I really wanted to make games again. So that's where my heart is. Well,
before we jump into that, one of the quotes that you have that I read in an interview that you had done was, you said that what you loved about Apple is that they were the smartest people you ever worked with, and you felt like you were just drawing in the corner with crayons, right? So that really says something for the teams that you were working with there.
Absolutely. The most incredible people on the planet, the smartest by far. I was always just gobstruck that they even appreciated my opinion. It was, they were leaps and bounds, triple my IQ. It was,
yeah, but I imagine they're saying the same thing about having you inside of their walls, right? So yeah, it's true. It's true, right? Just remember, you're never a prophet in your own land type of thing, right? So, I'm sure you had people there going, oh my goodness, like, we can't believe we have Graeme in here helping us to make sure we have a platform that game developers really want, right?
I was just a guy that was like, well, here's an idea. and it's drawn in crayons. Is that okay?
All right, let's move us on post Apple. So you wanted to get back to games. You started a company called GRL Games. And what does GRL stand for?
GRL is Graeme Rocky Laurie. So I left Apple because my daughter was getting into high school, and high school seemed to be showing her the future of, hey, your future is a cubicle, that was, I didn't think that was where, you can be a poet, you can be a sculptor, you can be a writer, you can be, a journalist, you can be anything in the world, you can be absolutely anything. And so I wanted to start a small company that was just the 3 of us that could go show her that. And I'm especially after Trial of Light, I wanted to keep it really small. I wanted to keep it just a small company. And so I was going to go write the next big game, the next big adventure game. I wanted to go write my next big game, and I was going to have her help. And so initially I had her go to GDC and give a talk with me, where she went through all of my games and she criticized them all. And she was very critical. And so, that was great. And afterwards, people lined up to see her to get, then become, also be critical of their games. But
wow.
My wife and my daughter had an idea of a game that they wanted to make, which was a solitaire game. And I'm like, I'm Graeme Devine. I'm a great game designer. I don't make solitaire games. And they're like, Graeme, you're making a solitaire game. And so, of course, I'm going to make a solitaire game. So I made a game called Full Deck Solitaire for the Mac. And it came out in 2011, and it's been the #1 solitaire game on the Mac since 2011. And it's on,
it is the solitaire game on our iPads and iPhones. And this wasn't downloaded for this conversation. This is what this is all the different versions of solitaire that I play. And I also go through and create different backgrounds and decks for different seasons and things. So I have a Sonic the Hedgehog deck, I have a Christmas deck, all those things. So we're big fans of that.
Oh yeah, when we break the customization, which which we get like emails, Graeme, you've broken customers. Oh, sorry. It's I've done that on Android like 4 times. It's and but yeah, and so it's been out for iPhone, iPad, Android, and Mac, and it's but Rocky would come in and say, Dad, I have this idea of something I want to put into the game. I don't think it's possible to program. And of course, when your daughter says that to you, you're up until 4 o'clock in the morning programming that idea. And so we added all the variations of the game, and it was one of the more rewarding games I've ever programmed.
I mean, getting to do that with your family, not just to create a really good, an excellent game that is universal, but to be able to do it with your family and do it with your daughter, I think is just really, how wonderful, right? Really.
And my mom, who's passed away now, she played it every day. And we would get, and we get emails from people that it's like, I want you to know what difference this makes, to my dad or to my mom. And we get emails from people saying, hey, my grandmother plays this one game that is really, really old. That's, and I'll go find the rules of the game in this book published in 1910. And we'd add, we'll add that game into the list of games. And I didn't know there were so many solitaire games.
Yeah, there are
80 or something. And it's a very rewarding game to work on. It's going to say on my gravestone, in Graeme Devine, he made solitaire and some other games.
Okay, we have but 2 other areas I need to move us through quickly so we can get to some Q&A. So also for our colleagues that are watching internally, if you have any questions for Graeme, please go and pop them into the chat. So, all right, so let's talk about your move over to Magic Leap. In 2013, you started with this company that was really building the future of AR. The only thing that we in the tech space knew that supposedly it was incredible, but the only picture we ever saw was like those cupped hands holding an elephant, right? And that was it. And we were like, oh, what is this thing going to be? So how did you find your way to Magic Leap?
Well, I was pretty happy in Santa Cruz, California, walking the dogs on the beach every day at GRL Games. And Ronnie Abowitz called me up one day and he said, I think I need a games guy. And I'm like, I'm good. And so he calls up again and he says, come to Florida. And so I went to Florida and I put my head into what's called the Big Bench, which was about the size of a Costco table, absolutely huge machine. And it generated a true scan light field. And so in front of me, this monster stood up and I could play around with it with the joystick. And I'm like, well, that's cool. And then in the back of the room, another large monster stood up and I hadn't noticed that before. And when I focused on it, the monster in the middle of the table went out of focus. And when I focused again on the monster in the table, the monster in the back of the room went out of focus. And so unfortunately, that still takes, as far as I know, a really big bench to replicate. There's no technology that's the size of a pair of glasses that does that yet. But that was incredible. That was like, oh, this is, I worked at Apple. I thought I knew everything that was technology-wise that was possible. This is impossible. I got to go work at this company. And so I said, I'll help you. You say you're going to make this the size of a pair of glasses. I'm not a hardware guy, but okay. This is, I'll help you. And so marketing released that video of the elephant, and we were all like, no, don't release that video. No, don't release that video. That's a bad idea. That and the whale. These are bad videos. These don't show what we're making. And so I helped a lot at the company up until the point of the $500 million raise, where we did that raise with Google, which was about 2 years in. And then I went to Ronnie and said, okay, the company's got 200 people working for it now. I'm really not comfortable. This is about the limit of the company size that I'm comfortable at. And about half the company was reporting to me at the time. I was the chief creative officer, and it was had a whole studio, a whole bunch of content. The operating system was starting. All of this was under me. I'm like, this is getting to be, Steven Spielberg's coming in. I spilled my coffee on me in front of Steven Spielberg. It was all, 'cause of course I'm going to do that in front of Steven Spielberg.
Of course.
And,
of course.
Really
I bet he remembers you.
I don't know. But it was, somebody takes me to coffee and he's like, Graeme, you can't leave. You're on the Wikipedia page. You were part of the $500 million raise. You're part of the reasons Google put all the money into the company. But you're going to become the wandering wizard. I'm going to take away all your responsibility and make you the wandering wizard. You can just wander the halls of the company and do what you want, but you have to stay. I'm like, okay.
That is a great title, man. Oh my God. And like I've mentioned to you before, I had the chief gaming officer title in 2001 or 2 at Sun. Like that was quirky enough, right?
I remember
in that era.
I remember being jealous of your title. I'm like, one day I want to have that title.
Well, Wandering Wizard completely trumps that, man. So you did it once again. You're the cutting edge of titles in tech. But no, I mean, yeah, I understand seeing something that is so revelatory, right? And can change the way we think about things. And I think we see inklings of that same type of technology, like in the new PlayStation VR headset, where they're constantly moving things in and out of focus, doing eye tracking and things like that to try to approximate what's happening. But you still need it hooked to this huge PlayStation 5 to get it done. There's nobody walking around here with this, right? But as we continue to learn more about how to get better performance yields and compression, get more efficient, right? These are the sorts of things that we will see kind of impact the vision that Magic Leap had for what AR can be. But yeah, that was just really early, and it just reminds me of what was it like at Xerox PARC back during their GUI system and the mouse and all of the things that they had done on the original.
Absolutely.
Right?
We know from Star Trek it's going to happen one day.
It will happen one day. It will happen one day. Okay, so real quickly, you're the Wandering Wizard there. And we know that Magic Leap had done some pivots, and you had all these other entrants coming into the VR and AR space, and you decide to leave Magic Leap.
We got laid off.
You decide to leave Magic Leap.
Well, actually, we were. I was working on a play. I was working on a play with the Royal Shakespeare Company,
Really?
with a bunch of other people. So I was working with as a Wandering Wizard, you get to choose what you want to work on. So I was working with the United Nations on climate change. I was working with the Royal Shakespeare Company on a new version of A Midsummer's Night Dream. And I thought, this is my perfect life now. This is great. I'm no longer a game designer. I now write plays, and this is awesome. And so the play was opening in June of 2020 in Stratford-upon-Avon, and it was a new version of A Midsummer's Night Dream, and we were doing it as an ARG, and I was working with Sean Stewart, the grandfather of ARGs, Austin Grossman, Andy Lanning, and all the people that we were making. We were taking over a store in Stratford-upon-Avon, and everyone in Stratford-upon-Avon thought a real store was opening, and we were actually, really making an alternative version of A Midsummer's Night Dream, and they were going to interact with it. So we had a whole 10 episodes arc set up for the whole thing. We were going to publish a real newspaper starting in April, and March 2020 came around and we were all laid off. And at the end of March 2020, the play got canceled. So,
okay. So I didn't know about this work, but I will share with you that I played Peter Quince at the Folger Theater in Washington, D.C. And back when I saw Don Daglow at the Smithsonian, we stumbled upon that and we just started quoting, from the play. And gentles perchance you wonder at this show, to wonder on to truth make all things plain. It's those sorts of things that you just remember for your entire life. So we're going to have to talk about that. I need you back for like another hour. But all right, so you're out of Magic Leap real quickly. You started up a new company called QXR Studios, and you're working on a new game called Metropolis Origins. And this is based on an IP from one of your original companies back in the 1980s, right?
Well, we started Quarantine Studios, it was because we were all left over from Magic Leap, and we liked working together. So it was everyone who worked on the United Nations project and the RC project. So we started Quarantine Studios because we were all remote. We were in London, Florida, New York, LA, just south of San Francisco, right about Monterey, and we started, which eventually became QXR, and so we love making narrative worlds. And so I'm like, well, I have this 1987 game I've been working on the side, on a new version of my game Metropolis. We can work on that whilst we're looking around for whatever we're working on. And so that became how we started working on Metropolis Origins before it became our main project. And so, yeah, we started to work on Metropolis Origins, and it started to become our focus a little bit, and then somehow it became our main focus, and we got to where we are today.
And it's a CCG, right? It is a card or a deck building game, correct? Based on Metropolis property.
It is a deck building game. Originally, it was a Web3 game, but we're kind of pivoting away from Web3 now. We made it a Web3 game originally because we do believe in people owning cards. I actually like the Magic the Gathering model. I like people going to Target and buying cards and owning them and actually having them. Mm-hmm. I think that's cool.
Agreed.
But I think that's the reason I owned so many Magic the Gathering decks. I like buying and trading cards with my friends, and I thought that was cool. Unfortunately, the Web3 space has different thoughts on what's cool. So and so do gamers, and you have to stick with where gamers are, and gamers are not in that space. So I still think that technology is cool, but you have to stick with gamers. I think eventually they'll that something like that will come back, so that you can have cards that we can trade again. But until then, we'll start making. I think we'll start to make some physical card versions of Metropolis Origins, because that's cool. Yeah. Just to be able to play the game physically. But yeah, we're definitely migrating back towards classic games, Web 2.
And we've seen a lot of that, right? Because much like Magic Leap, right, in the big bench, here's this big possibility space, but no, this is really what we can do with the technology. I think one of the things that, from a game development perspective and a design perspective, and then from a business perspective on the back of that, we really haven't found anything we can do with Web3 that we can't do with the current models or technologies that we have today. And the thought of ownership of a digital asset, and I do believe that there's an opportunity to apply scarcity models to digital artifacts, but I love the fact that you're talking about going back to create physical version of this, because one of the things I've always maintained is we are tactile creatures.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And so when we put everything behind glass, we're missing out all of these cues that tether us to the objects in our world, to the interactions with each other, right? And to that sense of permanence that they exhibit. So as we move forward, we can't forget that so much. I mean, the best controller we have is our bodies, right? We know how far our arms stretch, right? We know objects moving at different distances, at different speeds, kicking all different parts of the brain. Like, when we remove those things, I think kind of create this distance between the ownership of those, or the sense of ownership, or than we do versus the physical version of these things, right? So ownership of the physical ones, I think, really good.
Yeah, I think that'll bring people that Magic the Gathering feel. I think that's kind of, that's the feeling that I wanted to give people, and so I'm hoping that will work. So we'll give that a go.
Excellent. Well, we have a couple of questions that popped in here, but before we do that, Graeme, we have just blazed through your entire history. Again, this needs to be like a 2 or 3 hour dissection of everything that you've been involved in, because there's so much we didn't get to touch on. But the one thing that I would be remiss if I didn't ask this of you is, what do you feel may be kind of the next thing in video games that we're just starting to see now, or what is your hope for where we take the traditional models of games going forward? Like, what's really exciting you about future tech, future models, future types of games?
Oh, I still want to make a game called Ghost Girl, which is the game I wanted to make at Magic Leap. That unfortunately Ronnie never let me make. And it's about a ghost that lives with you. And so Ghost Girl is you get a set of cubes that you play with, and you sit with the headset on, and you work at the cubes can do things. And slowly in the next room, you start to see a light, and the light comes on, and you go into the room, and there's a ghost standing in front of you. And the ghost, sits there and points at directly at you, because we know where you're looking from your eyesight and what you're looking at. And then the ghost points at the floor behind you, and you look at the floor behind you, and there's the outline of a dead body on the floor. And so you're like, what the heck? And you look back at the ghost, and the ghost is gone. But in your ears, you hear, "Will you help me?" And you remember you have these cubes, and you start to form words and talk to the ghost. And so the ghost forms a relationship with you in your house, and you start to have adventures with the ghost, and you build up a relationship. And you have, I'll cut a long story short, but you have one day the ghost will come up and say, "Hey, Graeme, every day my brother walks past the house at midnight, and I can't go tell my brother that I love him anymore because I can't leave the boundary of the house. Will you go out the house at midnight and tell my brother that I love him?" And so you're like, "Yeah, I'll do that for you." And so at midnight that night, you go out into the street, and there's a ghost that walks up, and you look back at your house, and there's the ghost Alice there, and she's just standing there at the door or the window looking out, and this ghost walks up and stops in front of you, and you're like, your sister wants to know that you know that she loves you. And I've made a game where you have walked out your house at midnight to tell an imaginary ghost that the imaginary ghost that lives in your house loves you, and you're having to go to work the next day tired, and tell the story of why you're tired is because I stepped out of my house at midnight to tell a ghost that the ghost that lives with me is misses her brother, and I've and she also tells me how to do card tricks, and we sat and watched Stranger Things because she comments on it. And it's that kind of live-in adventure is something that I think is coming, and that's the kind of thing that I want to work on, because I think that's really kind of an interesting, interactive, livable game that can live with you, and I think that's perfectly possible to go make.
I love that. And it's providing, it is intertwining real emotion and story and humanity with the mechanics that are then based in the technology, right? Unlike, Pokemon Go, wonderful game, right? But after a while, it's like, what is my, kind of emotional attachment to these activities?
What's my tether to it? Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And making sure that we find the humanity in the games that we create and the experiences that we deliver, right? That's the next big thing. And well, not that it's the next big thing. We've always tried to do that, but now we'll be able to bring all of these technologies together to create something entirely different that just wasn't possible before. I think that's incredible. Incredible. So look, I know that we have a few questions in here, and we went over time because we had a little bit of a hitchy start thanks to audio, but we got that fixed. So Graeme, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today and doing this, again, this blitz through your amazing history. At every turn, you've inspired other generations of game developers, storytellers, and artists to think differently about the technologies that they're using. You've created these stories and these experiences that act as kind of reference points and things that we point back to as important milestones across games and game technology history. So thank you for everything that you've done in this industry, and I can't wait to see what you're doing next. So thank you.
We've all done it together. I mean, it's been a group effort. I mean, it's not been. There's no one person in the industry that's like in front, right? I mean, it's all of us running along, side by side. So that's been the best part about this industry. Always.
Awesome. Well, wonderful, and thanks again for taking the time with us today.
No problem.